this last session of Cambridge University, we've left the most controversial to the last. Why no platforming and speech controls strengthen the right? Mike Macnair is the speaker. Go ahead.
Okay, comrades, first point, very simple one, but I'm going to repeat two things. The first is simply the fact that no platforming and speech controls do strengthen the right. Back in October 2024, I wrote an article in paper which was published under the title "Crushing It in the Egg." And this was addressed to the question that the view of the left that sufficient violence against the fascists at an early stage of their development could crush fascism in the egg and prevent it rapidly developing. And I looked at where that came from. The Dutch comrades, in fact, translated this article, so evidently they thought it was useful. It comes from a guy called Daniel Guérin in the 1930s, writing about the rise of Nazism in Germany, and he quotes Hitler and Goebbels saying that if the opponents of fascism, of Nazism, had crushed it in the egg by sufficiently violent force in the 1920s, then they would never have succeeded. Now, in reality, of course, this Hitler and Goebbels story is complete bollocks in the mouths of Hitler and Goebbels, because actually the Nazi Party was one of a number of far-right parties which functioned as which organised veterans groups to beat up leftists as external auxiliaries of the German state, and with the support of the police and the judiciary, who protected them against the leftists who wanted to organise self-defence against them. So that even supposing that Hitler and Goebbels had been assassinated, just some other far-rightist would have emerged. But Daniel Guérin's book was translated by the US Socialist Workers' Party in 1939, and in the mid-1950s we've got American SWPer, later Maoist, Murray Weiss, quoting Guérin saying we have to crush fascism. The line of the workers' movement is to crush fascism in the egg, and therefore we're going to crush Senator McCarthy in the egg. This was a seriously unrealistic assessment of what was going to happen in the United States. By 1975, the SWP leader Farrell Dobbs, who'd been important trade union leader in Minneapolis, Teamsters strike in the 1930s, recognised that this crush fascism in the egg line was just wrong. What it does is it takes the small groups of the left and throws them into adventurous confrontations with small groups of the far right, which diverts attention from actually building up the mass organisations of the workers' movement, which, when it really comes to a threat of fascism, it's going to be the strength of the mass organisations of the workers' movement which matters. And the attempting to crush fascism in the egg is nonsense. However, from Murray Weiss, it comes back to, it's accepted by the Spartacists. It became one of the big differences between the Spartacists and the American Socialist Workers' Party in the 1970s. It's picked up by the French Ligue Communiste, and one of my quotes from this article was 1973, Alain Creville, standing in the ruins of the League's office, which had just been busted by the police for petrol bombing a far-right organisation, Ordre Nouveau. Creville says, we take the responsibility, we have to crush fascism in the egg. No freedom of speech for racists and anti-Semites. Revolutionists have to do so. And from, I think, Creville, this has spread to becoming a dogma of the far left. It's completely misconceived. Fascism poses two sorts of threats to the workers' movement, the first of which is the threat of physical violence, and the second is the threat of ideological poison of nationalism, racism, the idea that culture wars of one sort or another. The threat of physical violence is something which the workers' movement can defend itself by united front action without regard to anything other than the need to exercise self-defense. So you can agree that we're going to defend, for example, I gave an example in the article, the far left and the Communist Party of the United States organised self-defence against the LaRouchists who set out to break up left-wing meetings with iron bars and bicycle chains, motorcycle chains and stuff like that. When the National Front said they were going to suppress an IMG meeting on Ireland in the 1970s, Ruskin Student Union, which was controlled by the broad left, the Labour left, the Communist Party and so on and so forth, offered to host the meeting. And the meeting was held with guys from Ruskin with baseball bats and other such objects, waiting for the possibility of the far right, who said they were going to break up the meeting, didn't in fact show up. Self-defence, on using as much physical force as is necessary on the basis of just the unity of the whole of the workers' movement, yes. In relation to the ideological poisons, however, the ideological poisons are just as much presented by the Labour Party. Burnham is playing the game of immigration is adversely affected. Immigration is why there's insufficient, excessive immigration is why there isn't sufficient housing. I'm going to stop the boats and all of this stuff. Equally, actually, the Socialist Workers' Party, starting in the late 1970s, created the Anti-Nazi League, which was a unification with the Conservative Party and all forces to the left of the Conservative Party against the National Front Nazis. And the ANL was enormously successful. The reason why it was enormously successful was actually that a bunch of rank and file SWPers had organised Rock Against Racism, which was a musical anti-racist initiative, and the ANL parasitised on the enormous success of Rock Against Racism. But the ANL has been then succeeded by Stand Up to Racism, and the latest iteration is Together. They all have the same characteristic. You try and draw a line, a clear line, between the far right and the Conservative Party, which is a constitutionalist party. Such a constitutionalist party that at the Curragh Mutiny in 1914, the Conservative Party attempted to organise a military coup to prevent Irish Home Rule. The Conservative Party was the heartland within which the League of Empire Loyalists, which became the National Front, had its heartland. That the Conservative Party was the party of Enoch Powell when he gave his Rivers of Blood speech. Going back further, the Conservative Party was the party which promoted the stuff about, quote, hooligans, i.e. Irish immigrants, undermining civilization, and about Jews in the early 20th century, and about suspect French immigrant refugees in the 1790s, and about Jews again in the 1730s and 1750s, and Huguenot refugees in the 1680s. The Tory party, this Tory party is a party not only of nationalism and anti-migrant sentiment, but also actually of the organisation of physical force violence. The Riot Act of 1715, which authorised the use of deadly force against rioters, was directed against Tory party riots against non-Anglican Protestant congregations. So it is an extraordinary thing that we give a liberal colour to the Tory party with this unification. Then the question, okay, Alain Crivy, we will crush fascism in the egg. The organisation of the French far right, Pétainiste organisation in its origins, the Rassemblement National, is on the verge of power. The French league's policy has been so successful, policy of crushing fascism in the egg, it's been so successful, for that matter, in the United States. We look at the Trump administration, it's not fascism, but it's a far-right government. Meloni in Italy, the government, the Fratelli d'Italia, it's post-fascist, but it's the descendant of the MSI, the party of the Mussolini fascists in Italy. Second element of the policy strengthens the right is the anti-Semitism witch hunt. The anti-Semitism witch hunt is conducted on the basis that it amounts to that opposition to Zionism and in particular opposition to the Israeli state's genocidal operations in Israel amounts to anti-Semitism and is therefore racist. Cancellation of left-wing speakers and Palestine speakers, cancellation of meetings. We had, I think, Labour Against the Witch Hunt, we moved from place to place to place and finally wound up at a obscure council estate community centre because of threats and because of cancellation on the basis that holding meetings opposing the witch hunt amounted to harassment of Jews under Section 26 of the Equality Act, 2004. There's a paradox about this, of course, because the other side of this is that the cancellation of Kathleen Stock, anti-trans writer, conservative woman anti-trans writer at Sussex University, was on the basis that Stock's comments about trans people amounted to harassment of trans people under Section 26 of the Equality Act, 2004. And if we go back, in fact, to the debates about Section 26 of the Equality Act, 2004, the government, briefing Parliament, people were saying, look, this is an immense interference with rights of freedom of speech, and the government says, well, no, it will be read down by reference to the right of freedom of speech. The courts will read it down by reference to the right of freedom of speech under the Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. No such thing has happened. Partly, actually, because nobody's been prepared to spend £500,000 in the Court of Appeal testing what the relationship is between Section 26 and Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. The background is, of course, the sale and denial of justice in violation of Magna Carta by the free market in legal services. But nonetheless, what we've got essentially is anti-harassment rules as a limit on freedom of speech used primarily against the left. And it turns out that, for that matter, the no platforming of transphobes as a tactic adopted by the trans rights movement has provided nothing, has ended in the no platforming of trans activists on a much larger scale by individual United States, by the United States federal government, etc. The idea that it's exactly the same issue in reality as the issue of no platforming fascist doesn't work because it diverts attention from the actual tasks that are needed to fight fascism. It's also the case that no platforming on wider sense not only doesn't work, but provides ammunition, lends practical political support to the state no platforming the left. I'm going to go step from here to the why. The essence of the no platform policy is the People's Front. The idea is the unity of the left and the workers' movement together with the liberal bourgeoisie. Of course, you can have another form of unity of the workers' movement with the quite national bourgeoisie, which is support for nationalists. But nationalists generally are unambiguously anti-free speech, unlike the liberal bourgeoisie, who are willing to talk free speech as long as it serves their interests. The Trotskyists imagine that they are not popular frontists. They imagine that they're not popular frontists because they endlessly repeat the history of the failure of the Spanish Popular Front in the defeat in the Spanish Civil War, and the failure of the French Popular Front, which issued in a conservative government, and then the trahison, the great treason of the generals in 1940, and the victory of fascism in France. And then we leap in the history to 1973, and Unidad Popular, the popular unity government in Chile, and the efforts of Unidad Popular to unify with constitutionalist generals against fascist generals, and then it turns out it's the constitutionalist general Pinochet who organises the military coup against Allende's Unidad Popular government. Okay, but there's an enormous gap here, which it doesn't help us to leads to an enormous misunderstanding of why the left keeps going on with this stuff. And the gap consists in the fact that the fall of France and of Benelux and of Scandinavia in spring 1940 destroyed the strategic position of British imperialism, and in consequence created the situation that then when when the Nazis invaded Russia in autumn 1941, the democratic imperialists, that is to say Britain and the USA, were led to ally with the Soviet Union. That alliance with the Soviet Union amounts to the global People's Front between the workers' movement and the Soviet Union and quote democratic capitals. And under the banner of this Popular Front, we get the extension of the quote socialist camp across the whole of Eastern Europe, into China, North Vietnam, North Korea, and even down into the late 1960s, early 1970s. I think Cuba is part of it, but the last victory is South Yemen.
Afghanistan?
No, because Afghanistan was, it was agreed at Yalta that Afghanistan would be within the Soviet sphere of influence. And so Afghanistan, therefore, we have feudal monarchy with its army trained by the Red Army. And then Daoud overthrows the monarchy with a view to allying with the Shah. And the Soviets then let loose the communists among the army, which is then the Tsar Revolution, etc. So it's instantly before the Americans pretend that they didn't start intervening until the Russian intervention of 1980 in the faction struggle in the PDPA. The reality is that we've used it, in fact, a picture of Brzezinski with Islamist insurgents who the United States started supporting in the late 1970s, before even very early on in the Tsar Revolution. You know, so this is, Afghanistan doesn't reach the point of being, we can say there's a successful revolution. It's this long history of success under the banner of the People's Front, which has led to the left being gung-ho for the People's Front. And in particular, actually, the left has been under the spell of the US left, and in particular of the civil rights movement, which is a form of the People's Front because it's the working class as a class subordinating itself to the projects of black civil rights. And that's a part of, it's a policy which the CPUSA had developed in the 1930s, because the theory of the People's Front is that there's a democratic capitalist, uncompleted tasks of the bourgeois revolution. It's sort of weird to say that there's uncompleted tasks of the bourgeois revolution in the 20th century USA. Though there have been people in Britain who said there's uncompleted tasks of the bourgeois revolution in modern Britain, Thatcher's idea. And therefore, the civil rights movement, and then in that context, Vietnam intersects with the civil rights movement. The United States Army nearly falls apart to a considerable extent because of the endemic racism of the army structures in Vietnam. The Department of Defense, in the state core of the United States, now actively promotes anti-discrimination politics. Part of that, in a small way, Joe Freeman, Joreen, wrote about, famously about the tyranny of structuralists in women's movement organisations in the 1970s. He also wrote about, quote, trashing, which was denunciations of people for being insufficient. You can't, not a good feminist because you're not a lesbian, or you're not a good feminist because you're white, or you're not a good feminist because you're not working class, etc., etc. These sort of trashing techniques, which are characteristic of the United States Maoist movement. It turned out subsequently, when the stuff became, that though the FBI didn't invent these techniques, they picked up on trashing as something which they should amplify in the COINTELPRO FBI infiltration projects to undermine and destroy the left in these various movements. So what we get, therefore, out of these developments, the turn of the United States state towards anti-discrimination, and towards anti-discrimination as a policy directed against the left, which was already there when Gary Becker, Chicago economist, wrote his book in the 1950s, arguing that racism arises from the workers and not from the bosses, was already there when the US Libertarian Party in the early 1970s was founded on a manifesto of the defense of minority rights of women, black people, etc., and billionaires. the important minority. This policy, therefore, we wind up with the People's Front, which was the virtuous People's Front of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, has mutated into the People's Front of the left, together with the Human Resource Departments, the Council Equalities Departments, the COINTELPRO, the infiltrators, the spy cops / COINTELPRO infiltrators, not of that. That's what this stuff is. We go back to, I said at the beginning, the left has to fight fascism in two ways, one of which is united front physical force self-defense on the broadest possible basis of people who are actually willing to defend the right to meet, the right to march, the right to hand out leaflets without getting beaten up, and so on. But on the other hand, that we have to pose some alternative, and it is not posing an alternative. We cannot pose an alternative to the ideological influence of the far right in the form of practical unity with the Tories, or indeed practical unity with the Labour Party. We need to pose a positive alternative. Now, the problem with posing a positive alternative, the left as it is now is a very small minority. That's why people can hide behind. Socialist Workers' Party members constantly hold themselves out as, I'm just a speaker on behalf of Stand Up to Racism. I'm just a speaker on behalf of not on behalf of, but in a personal capacity as a member of the Unite in XYZ workplace, and so on and so forth. The left is a small minority. The reason why the left is a small minority is because we're in the shadow of the failure of the USSR. This is something which is taught to every child in school at the GCSE period. Everyone is taught about Europe in the age of the dictators, Hitler and Stalin as twins. The failure that there's endless ideological production, literary production, etc., about the failures of Stalinism. And if it, in a sense, that's something which could be overcome. I've given as an example, an analogous example, the Italian city-states all collapsed into factionalism and tyranny, with the exception of Venice and Genoa. And English dramatists, and not just English, but dramatists and writers and so on and so forth, endlessly teach the lesson that republicanism and democracy inevitably leads to faction and tyranny. The Duchess of Malfi, play The Duchess of Malfi. Quite late, Venice Preserved is a Tory play denouncing the parliamentary opposition by analogising them to factionalists in Venice. That's 1680, 81, I can't remember what the exact date is. So there was this, democracy and republicanism won't work. And that idea that democracy and republicanism only lead to faction and tyranny was utterly dominant between about 1400 and the late 1600s. It only ceased to be dominant when first the Netherlands and then Britain showed that you could organise politics in a way which was constitutional, but didn't give rise to collapse into factionalism and tyranny. The left, however, not only hasn't shown a superior alternative to the way in which the Soviet Union ran things, but actually continuously promises to reproduce the same crap. It promises to reproduce the same crap in the form of bureaucratic centralism, Socialist Workers' Party, the Comrade Delta affair of cronyism in the apparatus, the top-down management, the fact that the Comrade Delta affair involved sexual abuse by the woman's line manager. How the hell did it come to be the case that the organising secretary of the party is the woman's line manager? The answer is because they adopted Soviet model top-down appointment of district organisers by the centre. The same in the Socialist Party of England and Wales. Peter Taff and his mates expelled the majority of the Socialist Party of England and Wales's international organisation because they're not prepared to lose a vote. The same in reality in the RCP. I don't think we've got any examples in the Revolutionary Communist Party in the recent past, but we've certainly got a history of the same crap, like the Comrade Delta stuff, and with the same consequences in terms of cronyism and managerial, top-down managerialism in the precursor of the RCP, that is, what's it called?
Socialist Appeal.
Socialist Appeal and its co-thinkers, the international Marxist tendency. Equally, trade union-style bureaucratism and rule of law regimes, where we have really elaborate rules and standing orders, and people playing elaborate, complicated procedural games at the expense of allowing the membership actually to take a decision. Left Unity worked like that. The trade unions, of course, worked like that. The Labour Party worked like that until it became more totally Stalinised and bureaucratised. The latest devices, the legal control, where you have something which is a political brand with no rights in the membership, because the political brand is legally owned by an individual or small group. The finance is legally owned by an individual or small group. The data protection material is used to suppress the availability of information and so on. This is La France Insoumise, Podemos in Spain, your party, and before that, Momentum in this country. Fourth head, safe spaces. We had that in Left Unity. It was an endless source of fighting in student unions. At the same period, there were vast amounts of safe spaces fights and denunciations of people for disagreeing. Left Unity had the consequence that we had the one of our members, Laurie Macaulay, was charged with violating the safe spaces rules for reporting what happened in Manchester branch, though they didn't actually charge him with doing the reporting, they charged him with bullying other members in Manchester. When we finally got rid of that, the reason was because new brooms were put in the disputes committee, and they said I was there as the sort of Mackenzie friend for Laurie Macaulay in the disputes committee hearing, and the guys from the disputes committee said, we're trying to get rid of, because there's hundreds of vexatious complaints of misconduct and violation of the codes of conduct and safe spaces rules, which are merely being introduced because of political disagreement. And we have to, because the committee was totally overwhelmed. The previous members of the committee had resigned because they couldn't see any way of dealing with all of these complaints in a fair and reasonable fashion. Civility rules, our latest version, this is peculiarly dishonest. I think this is peculiarly dishonest in my opinion. We have setting up the Socialist Education and Debate Association, and Alex Green and
Tony Collins,
who are ex-Sparks, are pursuing the standard Spark policy of you get some people who you're in contact with and you corral them off from everybody else by a principle. What's the principle? Back in the day when Tony and Alex were recruited from the IMG, it was a matter of principle that you couldn't be in the same organisation as people who supported Solidarność in Poland. Implication, you can't have a faction fight which lasts more than 3 months, 2 months, and you pull the people out and segregate them, and then of course what they did with the people they pulled out and segregated them was say you've got to turn to industry, which of course the IMG was saying at the same time, you've got to turn to industry, but it's corralling them and separating them so that internal discussion, so that discussion is blocked. And as far as Alex and Tony is concerned, I see absolutely no reason, given their personal history, to believe when they say that the word nigger can't be used in a quotation. I don't believe that they believe that. It's just an excuse to break off relations with the CPGB, which is an excuse which they want because they aren't actually able to defend the substantive political differences. But this is just yet another. We've had this before. A year ago, Nick Rack and co. broke off relations with us in theory on the basis of the rudeness that we call them opportunists. You can't talk if you call them opportunists. But in reality, precisely because they were opportunists, they thought there was more opportunities would open up for them in direct relations with the leadership of your party. Surprise, surprise, what happened actually very rapidly after that was that Nick Rack was no platform in Manchester nor your party for being rude about the SWP people who were running that branch. I can't remember what it was anyhow, but nonetheless. We've had in the same things, say that, okay, it's not us. Richard Gerard has been forced out of the leadership of the Socialist Federation, which was a, frankly, slightly fatuous grouping of left group arising out of your party, because he doesn't toe the line with Judith Butler's theory of gender. I think that's part of why Prometheus won't talk to us, is we don't toe the line with Judith Butler's theory of gender. Certainly that's why Ollie split with us. We refused to know platform Marcus, who was here earlier this week, because he didn't toe the line with Judith Butler's theory of gender. Comrades who pursue these politics are actively saying to the workers' vanguard, the broad layer of militants who pay some limited attention to what the left says, and therefore indirectly saying to the mass of the working class, nothing is possible more than either Stalinism or managerialist capitalism. In reality, they're saying there is no alternative to managerialist capitalism, because we have committed ourselves, we commit the movement to the managerialist regime of managerial control, of the exclusion of people for speech, incorrect speech, safe spaces and civility rules and so on, controlled by the bureaucratic apparatus, of splits, endless splits into smaller and smaller fragments on the basis of purity and expression. The positive alternative, I'm not going to go at any length into the positive alternative, but the positive alternative, basic principle, one vote. Everybody gets one vote, one voice, freedom of communication and freedom of information, freedom of association, the right to enter into blocks and organise, to amplify the voice. Nobody gets a prior right to amplify voice simply by virtue of property rights, which is essentially the regime of the bourgeois media that Rupert Murdoch's wealth allows him to amplify his political voice in the form of the Times, the Sun, blah, blah, the Sky News, blah, blah, blah. Nobody gets a veto. The safe spaces regimes commonly involved in that the caucuses of the oppressed have a veto. The claim which is being made by Alice Green and co is that black people would veto any quotation of the word nigger used by somebody else. They aren't saying that they are black people and they veto it. They're saying that hypothetical black people might veto. So no vetoes, no bureaucratic control, majority voting. One vote, one voice, freedom of association and information, freedom of communication and information, freedom of association. That gives you fundamental principles. I've written at more length about general principles of democratic centralist decision making, and I'm not going to repeat that. But these basic principles, as opposed to bureaucratic mechanisms, either bureaucratic centralism or trade union style legalist bureaucratism, or etc., etc., etc. These are principles which actually pose an alternative to the regime of managerialist socialism, and therefore pose an alternative to capitalism. And by posing an alternative to capitalism, can pose a way in which we could do socialism better. And by posing a way in which we could do socialism better, can potentially pose an alternative which could reach into the layers influenced by the far right, and alternatively equally mobilise the working class as a class to counter the influence of the far right. So that's where I end.
So, can I see comrades who want to move?
We've got Jacob online.
Jack, do you want to wait for him to go first? Go ahead.
Okay, hold on a second. Hold on, Jacob.
Hello, hi, can you hear me? Maybe just give a thumbs up, something. Am I being heard at the moment?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Oh, I am. Okay, great. Thanks. Yes. So, yeah, I'm Jacob. For anyone who didn't know my name. Yes. So, I have like a variety of points, so I'll just go through them in the order that I wrote them down. So my first point would be that, just because something didn't work, such as like you mentioned or Mike mentioned the attempt to stop McCarthyism, that doesn't mean it was wrong to attempt it in the first place. But I won't go into that in detail, but I just want to raise that point. I would say that the anti-Semitism witch hunt would likely have happened anyway. I mean, I do agree to some extent that maybe the left gave some ideological cover for the project, but I think that ultimately the Zionist state is going to do what it wants to do. It doesn't require our consent or our agreement. I mean, certainly we don't agree with the interpretation of the law that's been put into place, but the state has done it anyway. I mean, similarly with the recent EHRC decision, I mean, nobody on the left really would agree with that interpretation, and it seems to be in completely bad faith, but nonetheless, the state has decided to do it anyway. As a general point, I would say that, yes, there's some value to open debate, but at the same time, what I would call shock jocks, they just want attention at the end of the day. Yes, sometimes they want to be banned so that they can say, yes, I was censored because I'm so right, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, if you just allow them to speak, unfiltered and unedited, then, that's also corrosive to the movement. And I would say that, Mike said that, no platforming fascists detracts from, real political work. Well, to some extent, maybe, but platforming fascists also detracts from political work. It takes up energy and space in the debate, which, is wasted, that could be used for actual positive purposes. I would say that a soft stance on fascists, maybe that's an unfair way to characterize it, but basically, taking them at their word and engaging with them in a more open way, I would say, is what you're describing. Yes, to an extent, that can be a good thing, but at the same time, if you take that too far, you're going to alienate, the majority of people, especially, trans, queers, minorities, students, blah, 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 the traditional groups that the left, appeals to. And of course, you can say, well, we need to broaden our appeal. Yes, sure, but, not at the expense of our existing supporters. Then we'll have no one on our side. Um, and, I think in general, I agree that we shouldn't ally with the state and ask them to censor our opponents, for us. But at the same time, we ourselves should have some kind of pragmatic, policing of our movements and our organizations, etc. And I would raise the point that speech control is a practical necessity. I mean, you can't even run a meeting of this size without speech control. What if someone raised their hand and started, screaming obscenities or just making silly noises or whatever? Obviously someone would need to cut them off. And yes, I understand that the principle would be, well, the majority will decide who cuts them off. But I think that's, a very vulnerable system because a lot of people don't have a huge amount of confidence when confronted with someone who resorts to bad faith arguments like, oh, well, it's my freedom of speech. Oh, you're not even going to hear me out. Oh, blah, blah, blah. So I think that, to some people, rules and formal structures are, a form of refuge to say, oh, well, you've broken this rule, so that's why you're not allowed to speak. And yes, I accept the point that over formalization and over bureaucratization is also, incredibly corrosive. But I don't think that rules such as in this organization, you're not allowed to say the N word, even if to some extent I have some sympathy with the argument that, well, we should have open debate and discussion and blah, blah, blah. But I can't really take seriously the argument that, like, by saying N word, that we're somehow detracting from the educational aspect and not able to discuss the topic of Marx's letters, fully, or that we're somehow losing some element of understanding. I think, that's kind of a ridiculous argument to say that. Um, and I think that the time that it would take to organize people against a speaker who's in bad faith is, again, a waste of time that is going to, alienate people because the majority of people, don't really enjoy arguing and being in a space with people whose ideas they vehemently disagree with and find disgusting. I mean, you know, the majority of people, I think, if they're in that kind of culture, would just be inclined to say, oh, that was shit, I'm just going to leave and I'm not going to come back. And I'm not saying that obviously no one should be allowed to say something that other people don't like, but we also have to be pragmatic and not continually confront people with things they dislike for reasons that, you know, are probably valid. Like, for example, comrades who are black, yes, I'm going to say hypothetically, would probably be more offended by, you know, the use of the N word. And I'm not saying they should have a veto over, you know, what everyone else can say, but at the same time, we should be sensitive, you know, as the majority to their feelings. And, you know, I feel that we're not really losing anything in this context by not being able to say the N word. Whereas, you know, for some people, that will be their red line that makes them too uncomfortable to participate. So just to hit a few more points, I see. So I was going to raise the point that, yes, you know, too much civility rules and so on can be very toxic and corrosive. At the same time, I think a lack of civility rules can also be toxic and corrosive. I would bring up the example of the SYP, which I was in, you know, until recently. I mean, many people spoke to each other in that organization in an appalling way, and nothing was done about it in almost all cases, because in my interpretation, it was easier for them not to. You know, the powers that be or the general community, they thought, well, if I confront this person about their behavior, that's just going to lead to more drama and more upset, and it's not worth it because then I'm going to get shouted at. So, you know, people found that toxic and that drove people away from the organization. Um, and I also think it's, I would say it's a bit childish to say that, you know, the dispute with, I'm not sure what organization it was that, you know, CPGB was trying to merge with, to say that they were being insincere by saying they had a problem with some of the things that were said about them. I mean, I understand that, again, we should have a culture of open debate, but at the same time, you know, we have to be realistic. You know, you can't try to work positively with someone while also like insulting them with the other side of your mouth. Obviously, there's ways to raise disagreements in a comradely way, but I don't think we should just seek refuge in this idea that, well, I should be allowed to say whatever I want because I'm right. You know, maybe you are right, but there's ways to, you know, bring things up and ways to go about things. And, you know, I also think that, you know, you gave a little bit about the positive alternative, but I think it's quite disappointing that you said you're not going to go into it thoroughly, because I think that there is no alternative to speech controls to some extent without like suggesting some positive alternative. And you brought up the fact that, you know, we shouldn't rely on proprietarian control of organizations and spaces, which I do agree with, you know, mostly, but at the same time, that's part of a pragmatic reality. If someone is going into their own pocket to fund something, then of course they're going to feel like, well, I should have some kind of, you know, propriety over what I'm actually
Can you start
funding.
winding up, comrade, please?
Sure. I mean, that was most of the points I wanted to say. I just think that, you know, standing on principle on every point is just going to alienate people. We have to be realistic and, you know, choose which battles are actually worth fighting. So yeah, okay, thanks everyone.
Yep,
That's
stand
the
there.
microphone.
Yep.
Okay. I wasn't convinced, Mike, depends what you mean by the left, about the success of the People's Front being explained by not the 30s, but the 1940s, 50s, or whatever you want to do. I can see why the official communist left does that, but I don't think that applies to the SWP or SPEW or anyone else. So I think it's an official communist thing. Maybe that then carries over into the Labour left. I can accept that. Anyway, that's a sort of an aside, really. I do think that when it came to left unity, I mean, that was a particularly sad example. I mean, I just add that included our friend, the partyist, Chris Strafford, was part of Laurie. I think, just reported a branch meeting, maybe used some colourful words to describe people, but for me, it's just a straightforward routine report. He gets suspended for how long? 6 months? A year? Something like that. It was just, justice denied. It was an inhuman regime. I mean, the guy suffered mentally because of that. Okay. Really just turning to Jacob, I suppose. I've just been reading a book. It's called Black Marxism, and it's by August H. Nimtz. I don't know if anyone knows him. He's been to CU a couple of times. When I see him online, I spoke with him at a mug get-together. Anyway, he's just published this book. I bought it because, one, because I know him and I enjoy his writings. But I knew if he was talking, if the book was Black Marxism, a critique, I knew he would have to be quoting Karl Marx. I knew because black Marxists want to accuse Marx of being a racist, right? Because he used the word nigger in a letter to Frederick Engels. And it wasn't only that, there's a whole number of occasions, not many occasions, but a whole number of occasions when he used that language. But this was in the midst of the US Civil War, right, where Marx and his co-thinkers had played a genuinely leading role in America in getting Lincoln elected and trying to direct the North away from fighting a constitutional war to a revolutionary war. And the key to that was freeing the blacks, freeing the slaves, unleashing the slaves. Their whole global strategy also consisted of how do we win Irish workers in the North over to the black cause, because as far as many Irish people in the North were concerned, they feared black competition. If you have free labour, they'll come north, they'll take our jobs. Marx is the leader of the International. And so not only do they champion black rights in America, they also champion Irish rights in Britain. Now, if you want, in my view, to have a discussion, you've got to be able to use the original documents. Given that this is a charge by black Marxism, that Marx was Eurocentric, a racist, and all the rest of it. So, to me, it's infantile. Oh, by the way, August, if anyone knows him, happens to be black. No, I don't think that's particularly relevant, but it's not irrelevant. Okay. In terms of Jacob, no one, Jacob, is saying don't fight McCarthyism. That's just dumb, sorry, comrade. That's not what is being argued. The real question is, how do you, if you want to repeat the crush McCarthyism in the egg, will it succeed? No. That's the argument. So, of course we want to fight McCarthyism. In the same way, we fought the witch hunt in the Labour Party, right? How? Did we have a view, you've got to crush it or the state would just do whatever the state wants? What a passive, what a defeatist view. Sorry, comrade, no, we fought it, right? The problem was that we weren't successful, and the problem was that what we had is John Landsman, the leader of Momentum. What we had is Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party. What we had is Jenny Formby, General Secretary of the Labour Party, and many others jumping on that campaign. That was not inevitable. That wasn't just the state, the state. This is a class battle. That's just like looking at a strike or a demonstration, a campaign, and just saying defeat was inevitable. No, defeat wasn't inevitable. We can fight back, we can win. The real question is how? With what sort of organisation? With what sort of principles? That's the question. So I find your approach, well, the word useless comes to mind. Okay, then you get into the question of speech controls, yes, but speech controls, but of course we have, how should we put it? We have the freedom of association. We also have the freedom of disassociation. The real question is that we live in a society, right? And so the idea that you want an environment that you like. I'm sorry, Conway, you don't live in Britain. You don't live in the real world. I can tell you, right, when you get on a bus and if you go around, go to a pub, go to a workplace, are all people all nicey? You know, is this society somewhere you can go, oh, I feel so safe, I mean, such common, look, when I first went to work, I don't know if anyone heard my boring story, my first job was in a foundry, right? I went to a small little place, you know, putting glass onto metal. My first workplace was, I don't know, 80%, 90%, 100, no, it wasn't 100% Bengali. The the foremen were National Front, right? What do I do as someone who's just come out of school? I go, oh, I should leave for another job. Well, go to another job, and what you'll find isn't something as crazy as that, but you won't find it that much different. And that's including whether you go to a workplace that actually has a communist convener, right? So I don't know what world you actually live in. We actually live in a world that's highly unpleasant, highly fragmented, full of bigots, full of people with backward ideas. You should meet my family. Sorry, So we do live in an environment that we find actually hostile, something that you have to confront, something we can actually change, right? So we cannot opt out, right? We can go and maybe live on a desert island, but you cannot opt out of this society. The question is, therefore, how do you change this society? CPGB, have we got a set of elaborate rules that says you can't say? We've had a school full of people from all over, I'm not saying all over the world, but from many different parts of the world. We welcome comrades who come from different political traditions. If you take Nick Rack, that's the guy that's being referred to, were we using rude words that, insult? I think we used the word opportunism. Look, if you're in politics, the idea that you can't use the word, that's bad tactics. I mean, sorry, comrade, have a read of the minutes of the Second Congress of the RSDLP. The idea that these comrades were just polite to each other, the idea that they didn't, exchange political categorizations, whatever the word is, political words about each other, it is just extraordinarily naive. And if you look, what Lenin gets up as chair at some point in the meeting and says, oh, by the way, if you think we're rude, you should have a look at the Germans, right? So the working class movement needs freedom of speech. We have freedom of association. That sets our limits, right? So, for example, and I'll finish with this one, Comrade Chair. For example, so in Labour Against the Witch Hunt, we had two comrades who again would be welcome to come here to debate, but we didn't want to be associated with them. That is Jerry Downing and Ian Donovan. And they were putting forward the idea that it's the Jewish tail that wags the world dog. You count the number of Jews, this explains America, the number of Jews in top positions in terms of the big business. We actually had to have 2 meetings in order to succeed to kick them out, right? We were determined, CPGB, to kick them out. That doesn't mean when I see Ian on a demonstration I want to attack him, right? Or Jerry. I think we've changed his view on that question. Jerry would be welcome in this organisation, right? So yes, we do set limits. Everyone sets limits. The real question is society. And that is a different question. Okay, can't we debate with fascists? Of course we can. Of course we must. That doesn't mean that we can't use baseball bats. No, it doesn't. Doesn't mean we can't use baseball bats to defend ourselves against them. That's it.
He said it much more eloquent than I could say it, but I think there's some important lessons I think we have to learn from what happened most recently in your party. But also in the campaign against free speech more generally. Sorry, that bloody camera is not good. Okay. So I think some people on the left have used this, the N-word controversy as a way to pretend, like Mike. I don't believe that Alex Green and Tony Collins don't understand the difference between talking about racism and being racist. I think them and other people have used this particular controversy as a punishment for what we're doing with the weekly worker, actually for criticizing them, for dragging things out in the open, and it's been an excuse to slap us down and to say, no, you didn't really want to discuss racism. You used words which make you racist. Basically, we've been called racist for talking about racism. What we actually tried to do, as Jack has outlined, we wanted to defend the left from the charge of racism, which will be leveled against us again. It happened in the anti-Semitism smear campaign when they did look at this particular Marx quote, they did get it out, and they charged the left, Corbyn, with racism. Look, he's a Marxist. Look what Marx said. He said, he used the N-word. That makes Corbyn a racist. That makes the whole left who's following him a racist. And that was the reason why we wanted to discuss it in the first place, to actually defend the left once again from the charge of racism. Instead, now the left has turned around and said you cannot debate that. In fact, they're making the right strong again through this particular stopping us from even discussing this campaign against the left. That has again strengthened the hand of the right, because we cannot explain this quote in context. We're not allowed to. Strengthening against the hand of the right. I think that was a really good way from Mike to explain it. Same on the trans question. I believe this is an issue that has been splitting the left all the way through. We've seen it in the Socialist Federation. I mean, Richard Gerard is a funny example because, of course, he's no platformed us before. Just a week before, he was no platformed himself. Us for using the N-word, and him because he's on the wrong side of the trans debate. With the left insisting on purity lines and insisting on you must get this right. If you don't get it 100% right, you have to be kicked out. The problem is this list is never ending. Once you start allowing, this is the wrong view on this is, we have red lines, as Jack said, we do have red lines on working with imperialists, supporting, sending weapons to Ukraine, asking the government to increase its defense budgets to help plucky little Ukraine is strengthening imperialism. That would be a red line for us. But questions like, ideological issues like, is a trans woman a woman? There's only one answer you can give. There's no gray, you have to give the right answer, and otherwise you're wrong and you're out. Is again we're weakening our own forces. We're doing the work of the right for them by forcing out half the people of the left are not acceptable to those with those purity lines, and it's making us weaker and weaker and weaker, and the right is laughing while we're doing it. And on this, talking to no platforming fascists, I entirely agree. And in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, every time somebody is asking it to be banned, the Links party now has a campaign to ban the Alternative for Germany. That makes them really radical, the more often we say it, the more radical we get. No, what happens, the more often you say it, the more supporters the AfD gets, because they look like, the whole establishment is lining up with the Linke against the AfD. They're marching arm in arm on, demonstrations against the right. The AfD is the only party, it looks on occasion, that's sort of anti-establishment in Germany. So anybody who's got any problem with the establishment, you know, they think that the link is lining up with the CDU and the government, etc. They are all in cahoots, you know. We have to put up an alternative to that and actually say, no, we don't want, you know, we don't want these ideas just banned because they'll grow, they're fester and grow. So yes, let's debate them when we can, or smash their head up when they attack us, but debate them when we can and show how stupid their ideas is, how stupid their ideas are, so we can win them over. We have a better alternative. But the left is actually not very confident about its ideas, about banishing this, you know, you can't say this, you can't say that. It's not a sign of strength, it's a sign of weakness. And the more we do it, the weaker we get.
Kristen wants to speak. I promoted him, but he hasn't come back. If you can hear me, David, please get back.
Can people hear me?
Oh, he's trying to speak, yeah, hold on.
Let me know if that's good.
We can hear you now.
Okay, is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I speaking as someone who's sort of kept up with the debate that has sort of I think somewhat prompted this. I'm less interested sort of in talking about the question of speech controls directly. I think sort of that background has sort of been trod there, and I don't have a whole lot that's too interesting to add. What prompted me to sort of raise my hand here was less sort of directly the issue of speech controls, and more I think what I think a tactical question of sort of what the useful what the useful ways to conduct ourselves in these situations when making sort of not only the argument against speech controls, but also the argument, but also our arguments generally. Sorry, if comrades don't mind sort of giving me a couple of seconds to sort of gather my thoughts here. I think that that we how do I say this? How do I say this? Oh, oops.
Do you want to think about it and come back in a bit?
No. What we need, basically, the point I want to make is that, on the one hand, yes, we need, we as communists need to be absolute in our ability to make our own political points, to criticize the perspectives of others, and that right, and we need to defend that right absolutely. In that respect, I absolutely agree with the position against speech controls. But it is sort of on a tactical perspective that I think I would perhaps differ with some of the CPGB comrades in some respects, because I think that in part I think the CPGB sometimes has a less than fully useful perspective on what self-censorship, on what often constitutes self-censorship. In that, I think it is important when we are making our arguments to ultimately part of the purpose of making an argument is trying to convince the other person of that argument. And I think that it is important that we are conscious. I think it is from just a tactical perspective, it is important for us to be conscious of, to both be conscious of making our arguments in a way that is geared towards convincing people rather than sort of satisfying ourselves that we are positing that argument in the most righteous or in the most righteous or satisfying way, while maintaining that the absolute principle that we need to be able to express our views in totality and without censorship of the content of those arguments. And sort of to sort of raise this point with regards to some of the debates that have been had recently. I mean, I think that I think that on the one hand, based on my admittedly sort of somewhat limited and somewhat incomplete understanding of the circumstances surrounding the so-called N-word debate, I think that the sort of speech controls that were suggested were, I think, inappropriate. I think they were blunt and crude. I think they ultimately they ultimately did not serve to solve the problem of racism. Obviously, I think that I think I'm in agreement with that point. At the same time, I think that sort of I think that insisting on quoting the word in every instance, on quoting the word directly in every instance, I don't think was politically useful to convincing people of the need to not have speech controls. And I think the ultimate purpose of sort of entering this debate is to convince the left of the correct position that we shouldn't have speech controls. And I think that sort of allowing ourselves to get caught up in these sorts of distractions in order to either provoke or sort of satisfy the sort of most absolute notions of this, I think is ultimately just not useful in terms of actually achieving what our aims here are, which is to convince people.
Can you start winding up, comrade?
Of the fact that censorship in the left is bad. And I'll conclude by basically affirming that I think that while we need to fight against the urge to self-censor, I think we need a useful definition of self-censorship that is more specific than sort of any sort of than considering at all what people sort of are going to feel about what we say before we say it. That's basically my point, if that was clear enough. Sorry if I was rambly at point.
Thank you.
Useful contribution.
Useful contribution.
Yep. I've got it on text.
Can you speak louder, so please?
Sorry. It should be, this is from Rafa, I think it should be clarified whether communists should have a principled position on free speech, freedom of association, etc., or if we have a position of favoring free speech insofar as it strengthens and grows our power and organization by unifying our forces, and we oppose it and do no platform, expels those with views and positions that weaken our power, cross class lines, etc. Principled effectively meaning absolutist in this case, which is his first statement. I have Jim, and then we have quite a bit of time. So
Jacob wants to speak again.
I know.
I might come in and chip in shortly and then come.
Do you want to come now, and then I'll take Jim? I think that would be better.
I think that would probably be useful. Yeah. Very short, I hope very short points. We do have procedural rules. I'm not, in relation to Jacob's points, we do have procedural rules that people don't talk at the same time that other people are talking.
You're allowed to heckle.
You are allowed to heckle, yeah, you're allowed to heckle. heckle, but you're not allowed to heckle to the point that it's fighting each other. We don't say you're entitled to have a PA system competing with the PA system. I'm not sure that wouldn't be a good tactic in relation to the US Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United that capitalists are allowed unlimited amplification of their opinions. To say, okay, you've decided that the parties are allowed unlimited amplification of their decisions by bringing PA systems into court. And however, that's off the point. We have procedural rules about speech, which, and these go back, actually, we learn them in infancy, that you don't talk against each other. Or equally, we couldn't call it useful communicative behaviour if I addressed you in Latin and you answered me in Japanese and neither of us understands the other language. But on the other hand, that's different from having substantive speech controls. Secondly, going along with that, the substantive speech controls which are about civility and about etc. The effect, who is going to enforce these? And this relates to Rafal's point, speech which strengthens our movement. What we're concerned with is the problem of how to subordinate the full-time officials to the membership. How to subordinate the full-time officials to the membership is essential to socialism. If we can't subordinate the full-time officials to the membership, we don't have socialism, we have Stalinism. And it's for that reason that we have a very it's not completely absolutist conception of free speech, because as Jack said, we chucked Ian Donovan and Jerry out from a communist platform in Left Unity.
Labour against the witch hunt.
And from Labour against the witch hunt. Over arguing because we didn't want to be associated with the idea that Jewish capitalism manipulating politics. But we do have broadly speaking, free speech, largely speaking, free speech absence. We have a free speech absence. We don't trust the self-appointed guardians of courteous, unracist, unsexist, etc. speech. And in point of fact, actually, there's this long history. You have to work more positively and try and find civil ways of bringing this up. This is Heinrich Kuno's objections to Rosa Luxemburg saying that social democracy is killing itself by backing German imperialism in 1914.
Or they're called stinking dung heap.
It's Georgy Dimitrov's argument for why the communists should not, the socialists say we can't unify with the communists, says Dimitrov, because the communists criticise us. We don't criticise anybody except insofar as they're splitters. Do comrades, comrades want to cling to this idea that that this is just tactics, but it isn't just tactics. It's not just about what's persuasive or not persuasive. I don't think Al Green and Tony Collins made a good faith objection in socialist equality. I think that was a bad faith objection. I think when Nick Rack argued that us calling them opportunists was beyond the code. You can't work with people who are opportunists. It's the same as the IMG leadership, when the Sparts were doing entry, demanded that the Sparts should accept that the Fourth International is a revolutionary organisation and denounce the possibility of its being centrist. Why can't you work with centrists? So these are these are precisely examples of bad faith objections. These bad faith objections are about things which people think that they want, they don't like open discussion and open debate. And it's what they're proposing is, in fact, bureaucratic systems of bureaucratic control. And because they're proposing systems of bureaucratic control, what they're actually proposing is that nothing more than there is no alternative to the managerialist regime. The presentation of this as being tactics is not addressing the question where you're actually concerned with bad faith objections. My one brief point. I agree with Tina's point about the charge of Marxist racism was part of the anti-Semitism campaign, and if we can't talk about Marx's use of language, then we can't defend ourselves in the context of the anti-Semitism campaign. So what we're talking about is people raising bad faith objections, and then saying, okay, we shouldn't debate with people who are in bad faith. I'm in favour of debating with people who are raising bad faith points. What I'm not in favour of is making concessions to bad faith points, because that's actually conceding the principle of bureaucratic management of discussion. Jack, in relation to the People's Front success, my understanding, for what it's worth, is that the left came to accept this at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, because of the success of the civil rights movement and the spin-offs arising from the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, and so on. So that the idea of liberation movements, that the left has to ally with liberation movements, as opposed to that the left has to project universal emancipation. This intersectionalist conception, that is the way in which the People's Front got into the heads of the Trotskyists. That's it. That's a secondary question, though. That's it.
I've got a couple of people who put on. I wanted to make a very short comment myself. Then it's Stan, then Pam, Jack, Jacob.
Katie is also.
Sorry?
Katie has got her hand up online.
Not yet. Wait. I'm making a comment. Then I'll call the other. One of the problems with the current situation in Britain and the support of sections of the left for what I would call curtailing free speech censorship is that the right is presenting itself as the defenders of the forbidden truths. They are the prophets of forbidden truths, and the woke community has stopped them. This has many consequences, one of which is that reform, for example, presents itself as anti-establishment. So we are constantly told by reform people, who actually get more presentation on main media than almost anybody else. There's been more reform speakers apparently on Newsnight than Conservative, Labour and anybody else. And yet they still consider themselves to be the anti-establishment organization. But I think long-term it does move the right if we keep pushing the state to ban these people, if we encourage the free speech, into more clandestine and possibly more dangerous forms of activity, which they do have already, but they can encourage more people into that. In terms of this debate about the trans question and banning feminists from appearing, what most of the left, I think, doesn't accept and doesn't realize is that in the public sector, in universities, in offices, and increasingly in the private sector, because the mood is that, the administrators, the HR community, the people who are in charge are actually following the trans diktat language. And they are the people who already ban people, encourage stopping people. And this debate will not go away with good wishes. This debate will not go away by us becoming the voice of the liberal bourgeois officials and the administrators. We have to have not the voice that says, we don't accept trans women, we want to ban them, we want to discriminate against them. We don't want to support what I would call turf feminism either, but we can't become part of that liberal bourgeois administration either. Stan, it's yours.
Yeah, we're on camera.
That's fine.
Yeah, Stan Keeble, CPGB. I've got a few points. I must say this stuff, was it Jacob, wasn't it? Be pragmatic, be sensitive, be realistic. Makes me want to squirm, doesn't it? It's, I mean, what you say to that, when you're speaking, you choose how you want to speak, you know. When I'm speaking, it's not up to you. Sorry, Jacob. That's it. I remember my experience in the union, in Nalgo actually, Nalgo and then Unison, you know, was first of all in the 80s. Because I never remembered any problem with speech controls in the 70s. I remember in the 80s we had one feminist, I'm going to say policewoman, well, speech policewoman, sitting in the committee, was well, you know, quite well accepted by people, by the others. We had lots of union committees in Brent. I don't know, when did Nalgo become Unison, you know, with that merger? Because I can't draw a line between the two periods, you know. Anyway, in the 80s this was, and so we'd be in the middle of a discussion about something or other, and the thing would be stopped, you know, suddenly it'd be a total stop put on the continuing the discussion because of some wrong word had to be sorted out first, and that was her job. You know, her job was to monitor and manage us so we wouldn't say anything that contradicted her particular feminist politics or whatever was accepted. So there was that, and the anti-racist policing came later. But there you are. I remember we had the zero tolerance question much more recently. You know, I remember it particularly from John McDonnell. You know, zero tolerance for racism. So that's very clever, isn't it? Very clever, because we'd just been, you know, we'd already been through a lot of the anti-Semitism equals anti-Zionism stuff. You know. And the left had been hoisted on its own petard, hadn't it? Because when someone's accused of being racist or of being misogynist, come to that as well. But you're accused of something, and then people back off because maybe it's true. You know, I can't quite tell. Can't quite tell whether this person is racist or not. Perhaps there's something racist in their nuance, or you know, there's some unknown quantity there, but maybe they are. So you back off, and people are afraid to defend each other. That's what happens. Anyway, so in that case, the case of anti-Semitism equals anti-Zionism is the big success of the ruling class, actually, isn't it? That they've managed to totally get the left on its own territory. You know, it's the left that fell for it first, and then they've been hung by it. You know, so you can't debate with people whether they're racist. I had all that actually from one of my daughters. I got blocked halfway through trying to explain what was it, Muhammad Ali. You know, no Vietnamese ever called me nigger. Stop there, right? You can't continue. I can't continue this discussion. Honestly, God help us. That's not the organised left. That's one of my family members. I just wanted to draw. just first before I forget it, we ought to, you know, one of the things we ought to do, one of the things we'll need to do is to get our own adequate meeting premises, you know. Because I remember during the anti-Semitism campaign thing, I remember sometimes, or no, was it? It was Momentum, yeah. When Momentum was going, we had access. Momentum had access to big trade union premises, you know. I remember going to getting off the train at Islington and going to Unite headquarters a few hundred yards away, and that of course were under control of whoever was in charge of Unite, you know. And there was a famous moment in a different premises where the TSSA bloke said, you know, if you keep going down that road, I'll close the building, right? But that kind of thing, you know. So it's great to have these big premises that belong to the workers' movement. Only they, you know, the bureaucracy can switch us off as well. So we have to have our own. We'll have to get our own premises at some point, which is much more adequate. Anyway, that's just a passing thought. Just on the question of exclusion, you know, it's been mentioned before, isn't it, that we had that thing, we excluded Ian Donovan and his part of, or when he was with Jerry, I think Jerry wasn't looking at the time. Jerry confessed, he confessed that he'd not paid attention for 5 years. We excluded the organisation from our campaign, but that's not the same thing. That's a question of drawing political borders. You can decide what campaign you've got and who's in it and so on, but that's nothing to do with silencing them. So actually, in the letters page, Ian Donovan's very welcome, right, to make his case. I just think that's a very important difference. Thanks.
I am running out of time, so no, please come. Yeah, I'll try and be quick. And then I've got two more, and we have questions on text.
Jim, you will.
Yeah, wait until I'm running out of time.
Right.
So I've got 5 people. Oh, right.
Look at
Go ahead.
audience. Oh, okay. Okay. So when Corbyn was, yeah, okay. Sorry. When Corbyn was elected, I was around the CPGB, and I joined the Jewish Voice for Labour, as it was then, and it's since become the Jewish Voice for Liberation. Not that I wanted to join the Labour Party, but I felt that as a Jew, my voice counted more, because I was more able, first of all, to speak about the issue, and secondly, to give weight to the anti-Zionist position. I should just say that I became an atheist and a communist around the age of 13, I think. So I wasn't particularly interested in the Jewish side of things, but my voice nevertheless counted. Anyway, this is just a little story, really. In my Labour Party constituency, there were, it was right wing, this is, what's it called, Dulwich and West Norway, South London. It was right wing, and we had a big, I would say a really good, lively left movement, which eventually won the positions in the constituency for the left, pro-Corbyn, in the sense that we were anti-Zionist and pro-Palestine. So that was the struggle of that whole period of 2016 to 2019. Anyway, on one of the WhatsApps, which was just used for, sorry, I better hurry up here, hadn't I? Organising. We're going to meet at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning outside the co-op. One of our comrades, Gary, his father was a kinder transport survivor, come to Britain. Anyway, he was expelled because he'd gone to a
political meeting that was pro-Palestine or something. And he said on the WhatsApp, I don't believe him, particularly, that he was so angry that he was going to say on this WhatsApp, which was never, no politics were ever discussed on it, that somebody on this WhatsApp must have betrayed him and told the bureaucracy that he'd gone to this meeting. And I thought, okay, and I thought, well, I better say something to support him, not just leave him isolated. So I said on the WhatsApp, maybe it was Asaf Kaplan. Asaf Kaplan was the Israeli spy that Keir Starmer employed to take charge of Labour Party communications. So it was sort of said tongue-in-cheek, okay. Anyway, so I was suspended for harassment. Harassment, that's interesting. And then, so I fought back against it. And then later on, they said, ignore this expulsion, this suspension letter for harassment. We're now going to accuse you of anti-Semitism. Yeah. So this is really important because, as Stan said, and all comments have said, the campaign to say that pro-Palestine anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is the key issue. The other issue which they're using to defeat the Palestinians is that the Palestinians are all terrorists. And I have to say, I think Pal Action have fallen into this, even though direct action has always been used. Nevertheless, the state is, of course, using this to label us terrorists. But the anti-Semitism one really is the strongest. And in that connection, I'll finish here, the use of the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, banning criticism of Israel on the basis of anti-Semitism is now coming into the NHS, education and everything.
So we have
Yeah. Katie, you're next.
Hello. Okay.
Hiya.
Thanks, comrades, for having me. So I wanted to sort of begin just by saying it's very easy to say that we fight for democracy and that our opponents simply are not. But I think the very nature of this reveals a contradiction within and of itself. The comrades from the CPGB quite correctly argue that we need to have democracy, or as I would phrase it, a proliferation of political expression. This has to be both within political organizations and outside. This has to be one of the most important things that we can fight for. Licht und Luft, light and air. We need political freedom. And I would also agree that the existing liquidationist left has imposed a sort of bureaucratic self-censorship, and this undermines objectively its own ability to organize. However, the rejection of political freedom and anti-democracy also constitutes a form of political expression itself. Censorship is a form of self-defeating expression. And to this end, in my opinion, anti-democracy must also be defeated politically and not through sort of abstract condemnations of our sort of, opponents. I think the point of democracy is not simply to just talk until the cows come home, but it is to produce political outcomes or to arrive at shared actions. And to this end, democracy must be understood as a struggle or a battle to win people to our ideas, with our words and our actions being our weapons, in a sense. And like, one of those ideas that we have to win people to is democracy in the first place. And analyzing the sort of debates that have been happening here in like Communist University, as well as in the Weekly Worker, as well as in the broader left, I've kind of come to the conclusion that if comrades sort of go into a debate, whether that is for democracy and political freedom or something else altogether, with only arguments that it knows ahead of time will just alienate its opponents, or not be effective, in a sense that like you've just gone in for the shock and the horror of it, then and then declare your opponents to just be anti-democratic, which, mind you, in many cases will be true, then this sort of reveals sort of very little confidence in the ability to win comrades to your positions, in this case, to democracy in the first place, and to openly have a debate. And also very little confidence in your own opponent's ability to be won in the first place. There is a bit of a problem, at least I would argue, in a lot of these cases where it often takes two to tango. It often requires both or all parties to be willing and able to openly discuss and debate with each other. And if one party or the other says, well, I'm just not going to enter the room and have that debate, well, this has already caused a problem. And so I think the first struggle for democracy is always the struggle for itself to exist in the first place, for the debate to even happen, for comrades to even be in the room. And I kind of want comrades to think a little bit, to reiterate on something that Comrade David said earlier, which is that we need to be thinking about strategy when we're sort of having a debate. And I kind of urge comrades to sort of think about, like, what do you say ahead of time? Like, what sort of position is your, democratic opponent going to take? What are they going to respond to? Rather than just rely on the sort of shock and horror, or just rely on asserting abstract principles without being willing to understand where your sort of democratic opponent is sort of coming from. That's all I would really like to say for now. But
Thank,
yeah, thank you for having me, and I've enjoyed everything so far.
thanks,
See ya.
Katie.
To speak, so I'm only calling Jim and then Jack, and I'm afraid I have to close the list. We don't have indefinite time here. Jim.
A lot of what's been said online, unless I've misheard or misunderstood, seems to me that we don't want to upset people. If you upset people, you can't win them, which is what the whole sort of the whole thing is about, really, isn't it? No platforming, speech control. Don't upset people. We have rules. What rules? It struck me, Nick Rack last year, the main rule he wanted was that he should be the General Secretary of the United Party. That was never going to run. Mike was saying about procedural rules. One of them in company sort of thing, in social company, is that some people talk too much. I hope not me now, but also if they're interrupted, they generally stop and let the person interrupting speak. In the Labour Party, I joined the Labour Party, Corbyn time. We had a couple of hundred every month, I think, at meetings. The main tactic they have is boring people to death, of course, all the procedure. That one talks, that one talks, that one talks, and so on. Last thing. Labour against the witch hunt. Of course, we had Ken Livingstone, Tony Correstein, Jackie Walker, others, expelled for anti-Semitism. But if you look at what they actually said, the important thing is, was it true? And I'd say yes, in these particular circumstances. the ones who went for them tended to be liars, hypocrites and thugs, like the one that went after Livingston. Calling him a Nazi and pushing him up. And then recently we've had, is it Steve Miller, the Bristol bloke, won his appeal and, yeah, nearly done. But how many years? That's it.
Yeah, Jack Conrad again. Thanks for letting me speak twice. Yeah, I think in terms of Jacob, I think Stan actually answered you. You know, if you want to convince the other person, if you think that going about it the way that you go about it, that's fine for you. You know, go ahead and do it. But what happens if Stan gets up and does it in a different style that you don't like? I'm sorry, in a democratic organisation, you have to put up with it. Right? Even if someone went in deliberately to the Sparks, by the way, you deliberately go in to shock. We do, oh, by the way. They never do they? But if you want to shock, that is up to you. You choose your own argument. You choose what you want to do with that argument. It's actually not true that you necessarily, in a debate, want to convince the other person you're debating with. Right? You might want to convince others. It's up to you to choose. If I was debating with a fascist, I might want to convince them. I genuinely might. But I also might be saying, what about their rank and file? Or what about our side? I don't know, but whatever it is, it's up to the speaker to choose it. So your tactics, you're so clever, right? You think you can go about it in such a reasonable way, and we are so cack-handed. Well, I'm sorry, okay, we're cack-handed, you're brilliant. No, you approach things the way you want to approach things, we'll approach it, I'll choose how I want to approach it. Mike will choose a different bloody way. Stan will choose a different way. Jim will choose a different way. It's up to the individual comrade. So, okay, what was the actual specific incident? Did we go out to shock? Was the CPGB PCC sitting there? How do we go out and shock the rest of the left? Ooh. No, we had a comrade around us called Ian Spencer who proposed a lecture on this socialist, whatever it's called, get together about Marx and racism, right? He was told that in the process, he couldn't use the N-word, right? He actually apologised for even thinking that he could use the N-word, right? But we said, no, we think you're wrong, right? It wasn't some plot. It wasn't some sort of devious way. How do we ring the bell and draw attention to ourselves? No, quite the opposite. In the same way, when it came to the anti-Semitism witch hunt, it wasn't a question of us shocking and saying Marx wasn't a racist when he talked about, the Sabbath Jew, which was quoted as proof that he was a racist. No, right? It wasn't shock value when we said Ken Livingstone isn't a racist, Jackie Walker isn't a racist, Tony Greenstein isn't. Stan Keeble over there was sacked from his job for using the wrong words. And what was the wrong words?
It was something about the Zionist movement collaborating.
The Zionist movement collaborated with the Nazis in the 1930s. That's true. That's true. He was sacked for talking the truth, right? Now, even if he was wrong, he should be allowed to say it. But the very fact that he was sacked for saying something that's true illustrates the point. Should he have said it this way? Should he have said it that way? Should he have said it another way? It's up to him to choose. And Jacob, you can then turn around and say, I wouldn't have said it that way. And maybe we could turn around to you and say, I wouldn't say it that way. Okay, let's learn from each other, but we don't lay down rules. We don't lay down rules. If you say it in a way I disapprove of, I'm going to close you down. I'm going to censor you. I'm going to, anathemize you. Anyway, freedom of speech, not without limits. We all set our organisational boundaries, but anyway, other comments have come up with it. Freedom of speech in society, freedom of speech within the party and in our movement.
So the questions from text have been read by the speaker, Ian Sharp.
Okay, I'm actually going to say very little. Mike Mitchell raised the question in the chat of pronoun use in personal conversation and related things. And I'm actually not going to talk about that because I think what people do in personal conversation and how they behave to other people in relation to other people's personal conversation is totally secondary and not relevant to this discussion. Matt, what do we do about no platforming in situations where the debate is controlled by the opponent and the opponent publishes edited text which makes us look bad? Short answer to this, actually, we publish the full fucking text. Yeah. Our method of dealing with that, and that actually, if it's going to have any success at all, obviously there's limits to this thing. When the capitalist class is backing X, as with the anti-Semitism witch hunt, the extent to which we get heard is problematic, but our general approach is going to be, we publish the full thing. And by publishing the full thing, we expose the fact that the selective edit is false. Rafal, why would we support excluding Ian Donovan and not excluding Richard Gerard on the ground of Salford, which is to separate itself from Richard Gerard? We fought politically with Ian Donovan. We argued against the idea. We did several weeks' worth of public polemic against the idea that US support for Israel is caused by the Judaization of the capitalist class, which Ian was arguing. We didn't say we exclude Ian without discussion. We excluded Ian after substantial discussion. And that's the difference, that this exclusion of Richard Gerard from Salford without discussion is preemptively refusing that discussion. And it's exactly the same, actually, in relation to Ollie and CPGB's note, and the question of whether we should no platform Marcus on the question of gender and biology. Yeah? We went on, I published a series of 4 articles on the theoretical aspects of the trans question. I invited Ollie or anybody else who wanted to respond to them. We went on, we published draft theses. We had kept the draft theses in print for a year before coming back to vote for them. Ollie by this time had left us. He left us not because because he wasn't willing to see it discussed. Yeah? And it's the same with the exclusion of Richard Gerard. It's not, okay, suppose that Solfed comes along and takes a position that it's in favour of social construction of gender as part of the fundamental principles of Solfed. Yeah? And there's a discussion of that. That's not an unprincipled or anti-freedom of speech thing to do. But that you exclude it on the basis without a discussion and without being willing to answer. And what we've got in the same way, our defence of Laurie Macaulay in Manchester Left Unity against basically spurious accusations of bullying on the basis that he had published a report of a Manchester Left Unity meeting in the Weekly Worker. our defence of the our persistent defence in the anti-Semitism witch hunt in face of considerable pressure to shut up about this question, and a lot of the left saying the right thing to do is, if we shut up about it, it will go away. If we keep quiet about it, it will go away. No, he said we have to fight openly on this question. Nick Rack breaks off talks with us over us calling him an opportunist. He doesn't explain why he's not an opportunist. It's just unacceptable. You know, he could perfectly well say, "No, I'm not an opportunist. This is incorrect, or this is an incorrect use of the term opportunist." He doesn't say that. He just says this is unacceptable. Actually, I think I rightly infer that this was a bad faith objection. And then the arguments that comrades are making about the tactical questions. You know? The reality, we have not heard from the comrades of Marxist Prometheus why they aren't prepared to talk to us. The nearest we've got is the fact that is Ollie's refusal to discuss the trans question. We have not heard from the comrades of Marxist Unity Caucus why they're not prepared to talk to us. The nearest is, as far as I can see, that they thought that if Nick Rack was on board, they wouldn't be in danger of being in a minority in CPGB. I don't think they were in danger of being, in any circumstance, in danger of winding up as a minority in CPGB. But no explanation of why this is. And then what the comrades come along and say, we should be more tactical and see what people respond to people's sensitivities. And now I say, I repeat this point, this was Heinrich Kuhnau's argument for social imperialism, for suppressing anti-war speech. Actually, that has persistent pertinence in relation to Marxist Unity Caucus in RS21, because RS21 has apparently been persuaded to change its position on Ukraine, and certainly been persuaded to break with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. Actually, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty has broken with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign because the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign is too closely connected with the far right. But the level of publicity about this change of position in RS21, a level of publicity about RS21 having any position on the Ukraine war, we've been covering the Ukraine war systematically, not every week, but a great many weeks. RS21 is exceedingly erratic in whether it covers the Ukraine war or not. And the MUC guys are in unity with people who are advocates, who are the minority, who are still advocates of the Ukraine war. It's not that you can't be in unity with people, with social chauvinists. Not that it has to be a split. So it should be fought out openly in public. Because if you don't have it fought out openly in public, the line which comes across and which is dominant is the line of the Labour bureaucracy, which in this case is continued UK support for Ukraine. They're also in solidarity with Dave Renton, who, in organisation together with Dave Renton, who thought there was a genuine anti-Semitism problem in the Labour Party, who has published a book, actually, to the fact that there's a genuine anti-Semitism problem. So this is back to this issue. We are being asked that we're scandalising, we're publishing scandalising stuff, we're intervening in a way which is not tactical. Actually, the problem, and it's a problem which goes back to 2014 and goes back earlier in reality, it goes back to Arthur Scargill and the Socialist Labour Party, and etc., etc., etc. The story of the Weekly Worker was a scandal sheet. I was denounced by John Rees for asking a question in the Oxford Respect meeting about differences within the Respect leadership. No differences within the Respect leadership. 1 week later, the split. And I was, no, precisely again, the Weekly Worker is a scandal sheet. This is not about our clumsy tactics. It's not about our shock tactics. Occasionally, we may want to use shock tactics. This is about, going back further, with the 2011 Workers' Power split into 3 parts: Workers' Power, Permanent Revolution, and a youth group around I can't remember who the third person, the youth group, and then they tried to get together and imitate the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste in France by setting up an organisation called the New Anti-Capitalist Initiative. And Richard Gerard, repeating again, was arguing for the New Anti-Capitalist Initiative to combine with the mosque to run a campaign against gambling houses, against bookies. We, not as PCC comrade, but a couple of younger comrades wrote some very sarcastic articles about this tiny group, which consisted of 3 trot fragments and a few anarchists, pretending to be a mass campaign which could unify with the mosque. And those sarcastic articles were the bad culture of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which led Cat Rylance and Chris Trafford to split with us. Okay, it's sarcastic, but to be honest, how serious is this? And I think that comrades are being it's the exact opposite of what comrades are complaining about. Comrades are complaining about CPGB using crude, clumsy tactics and not attempting to persuade our interlocutors. The reality is the reverse, that what's involved is a dominant culture of dishonest tactics, of bad faith objections raised on the left, of which the N-word story is just the latest example of bad faith arguments in favour of the maintenance of bureaucratic managerialist conceptions of how to run a political organisation. That's it.